That's not your daughter," Black Janitor Elijah Carter said quietly to the empty office at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday night, as he stood frozen beside his cleaning cart, staring at the framed photograph on CEO Caroline Weber's desk. A picture of a blonde girl around 11 years old with distinctive heterochromia that made her left eye blue and her right eye green. The same rare genetic condition that had been mentioned in every missing persons bulletin for Sophia Martinez, who had vanished from Dolphin Mall in Miami 8 years ago when Elijah had been the lead detective on a case that had destroyed his career, his marriage and his faith in his ability to protect innocent children from evil that hid in plain sight. At 48, Elijah possessed the kind of haunted recognition that characterized former detectives whose expertise remained intact, but whose careers had been destroyed by cases they couldn't solve. His eyes still automatically catalogued facial features and distinctive markers. His mind still processed missing children's databases that he had been forbidden from accessing after his termination. But his heart had learned that professional failure could be so complete that even being right about trafficking rings didn't matter when institutional systems refused to believe evidence that seemed too elaborate to be real. But the photograph before him contained details that 8 years of obsessive memory couldn't mistake. The heterochromia was rare enough, but combined with the small strawberry birthmark below the right ear and the slightly crooked left pinky finger that had been broken and healed incorrectly, this was unquestionably Sophia Martinez, the 3-year-old who had disappeared while her mother had been trying on shoes at a department store. The child whose case had consumed Elijah until his captain had ordered him to stop wasting department resources on conspiracy theories about organized trafficking rings. The office was empty. Caroline Weber worked late hours that Elijah's custodial schedule had learned to navigate around, but tonight she had apparently left by 10 p.m., giving him access to personal workspace he typically avoided because seeing successful people's family photos made his own professional destruction feel even more complete. "Ms. Weber, I need to speak with you immediately about the child in your office photograph," Elijah said into his phone at 11:34 p.m., calling Caroline's direct line, despite knowing that custodial workers weren't supposed to contact executives after hours about anything other than building emergencies. "This is Caroline Weber's voicemail. Please leave a detailed message," came the automated response that forced Elijah to confront that explaining child trafficking allegations via voicemail represented both professional suicide and potential warning to whoever had placed Sophia with Caroline if his message was intercepted or misunderstood. For 17 minutes, Elijah paced the empty office while processing implications that were both professionally redemptive and morally devastating. He had been right about trafficking rings. Sophia Martinez was alive, but she had been living as Emma Weber for 8 years, while her biological mother Maria had spent those same years searching desperately for daughter who had been stolen and sold to wealthy woman who apparently had no idea her adopted daughter was actually kidnapped child whose real family had never stopped looking. At 11:51 p.m., Caroline Weber's Mercedes pulled into the executive parking garage. Elijah had called building security, claiming he had found concerning documents in her office that required immediate attention, using vague language that had prompted security to contact Caroline about potential corporate espionage, rather than revealing that custodial worker wanted to discuss her daughter's actual identity. "What documents did you find?" Caroline demanded, as she entered her office at 11:58 p.m., her designer suit suggesting she had been at dinner meeting rather than home with daughter, whose bedtime Elijah knew from case files should have been hours ago if normal parenting schedules applied. At 39, Caroline Weber possessed the kind of controlled authority that characterized successful tech CEOs who had built billion-dollar companies through intelligence and determination. Though her defensive posture suggested that unexpected midnight summons from building security had activated professional paranoia about corporate theft, rather than preparing her for revelation that would destroy everything she believed about her family. Ms. Weber, I apologize for the deception about documents, but I needed to speak with you immediately about something that couldn't be explained over phone or voicemail. Elijah said, his voice carrying the careful authority he had once used when delivering devastating news to families whose missing children had been found in circumstances that required immediate action rather than gentle preparation. Then explain quickly, because I left my daughter with babysitter and told her I'd be home by 12:30. Caroline replied, her mention of daughter making Elijah's professional obligation even more urgent and personally complicated. Ms. Weber, the child in that photograph, the one you call Emma, is not who you think she is. Elijah continued, watching Caroline's expression shift from irritation to confusion as she processed that midnight emergency involved her daughter rather than corporate espionage. What are you talking about? Caroline asked, her voice carrying controlled alarm about custodial worker making statements about her child that seemed both impossible and oddly specific. Emma is my daughter. I adopted her legally through private agency in 2015. Ms. Weber, that child's birth name is Sophia Martinez, Elijah said, using the direct communication that crisis situations required, despite knowing that his next words would detonate Caroline's understanding of her entire family structure. She was kidnapped from Dolphin Mall in Miami on August 14, 2015, when she was 3 years old. I know because I was the detective assigned to her case, and I've spent 8 years looking at her face in case files, wondering where she had disappeared to and whether she was still alive. The statement hit Caroline like physical violence, not because she immediately believed that her daughter was kidnapped child, but because custodial worker was making specific accusations using dates and locations and professional background that seemed impossible to reconcile with his current employment cleaning office buildings during midnight hours. That's insane, Caroline replied, though her defensive tone suggested growing awareness that Elijah's specificity and former law enforcement background made his claims more threatening than typical delusional accusations. I have legal adoption papers. Emma came from agency that specialized in private adoptions for families who valued discretion. Her parents died in car accident, and I gave her stable home when she had no one else. Ms. Weber, I need you to look at your daughter's distinctive features and compare them to this missing persons bulletin from 2015, Elijah said, pulling up 8-year-old document on his phone that showed 3-year-old Sophia Martinez with same heterochromia, same birthmark, same crooked pinky that Emma Weber displayed in every photograph on Caroline's desk. Sophia Martinez, age 3, kidnapped from Dolphin Mall, August 14, 2015. Distinctive features: heterochromia, left eye blue, right eye green, strawberry birthmark below right ear, crooked left pinky finger from healed fracture. Last seen wearing pink dress with white flowers, Mother Maria Martinez is desperately seeking any information about her daughter's whereabouts. Caroline stared at the bulletin with hands that had begun trembling as she processed that the distinctive features listed for kidnapped child matched exactly the unique characteristics that had made Emma seem special when Caroline had first met her during adoption process that had seemed too perfect to question because she had been so desperate for motherhood after losing her biological daughter to complications that hospital had never fully explained. This is a coincidence, Caroline whispered, though her voice carried none of the conviction that her words attempted to project. Heterochromia affects 1 in 200,000 people. The birthmark could be similar but not identical. The pinky... Ms. Weber, when did you adopt Emma? Elijah interrupted, his question both gentle and prosecutorial. September 2015, Caroline replied, her voice barely audible as she processed that adoption had occurred exactly 1 month after Sophia Martinez had been reported missing, creating a timeline that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. And how much did the private adoption agency charge? Elijah continued, using interrogation techniques that his detective training had made automatic despite 8 years of custodial work. $80,000. Caroline said, the amount suddenly seeming less like premium service fee and more like purchase price for stolen child, whose real family would have given anything to have her returned, rather than sold to wealthy stranger who could afford to pay for daughter who was actually available for legitimate adoption. Ms. Weber, I need to contact Maria Martinez and FBI immediately, because if Emma is actually Sophia, and the evidence strongly suggests she is, then you are unknowingly harboring kidnapped child, while her biological mother has spent 8 years in agony believing her daughter might be dead. Elijah said, his voice carrying both professional obligation and personal recognition, that he was about to destroy Caroline's family while potentially reuniting Maria's. No, Caroline replied, her voice rising to something approaching panic. You can't take my daughter based on coincidental features and conspiracy theory about adoption agency. Emma is mine legally. I have papers. I've raised her for 8 years. She doesn't remember any other family. You can't just... Ms. Weber, I can't take your daughter, but FBI can investigate trafficking ring that I believe sold Sophia Martinez to you through fraudulent adoption agency, Elijah replied, using careful language that acknowledged both Caroline's parental bond and legal reality that kidnapped children must be returned to biological families regardless of adoptive parents' genuine love or legal paperwork obtained through criminal enterprise. Caroline's scream when full implications hit her wasn't loud. It was the kind of internal devastation that emerged as strangled sound when someone realized that everything they believed about their family was lie constructed through criminal conspiracy. And that loving daughter completely and genuinely didn't matter when that daughter had been stolen from another mother who had loved her first and never stopped searching. Some discoveries about immediate tragedy reveal that the children we love most might not be ours to love, and that genuine parental devotion can coexist with participation in child trafficking when adoption systems allow wealthy people to purchase children without questioning too carefully where those children came from or why their availability seemed too convenient to be entirely legal. Before we continue with this devastating revelation, I need to ask you something important. If this story is gripping you, if you're feeling the horror of what Elijah just discovered and the nightmare that Caroline is about to face, please subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you stories that explore the darkest corners of human experience: child trafficking, stolen identities, and the impossible choices that come when love collides with truth. Hit that like button if you're feeling the tension of this moment, because this is just the beginning. This story gets so much more complicated and heartbreaking than you can imagine. And I need you to comment below and tell me, what time is it where you're watching? What country or city are you from? Have you ever discovered that something you believed was true was actually a lie? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and exposing a terrible truth? The investigation that would force Elijah Carter to confront his greatest professional failure while potentially creating new trauma for multiple families began at 12:47 a.m. in Caroline Weber's office. 49 minutes after she had learned that her daughter Emma might actually be kidnapped child named Sophia Martinez, and 6 minutes after Elijah had called his 16-year-old son Noah with request that would either redeem his detective work or create legal complications that could destroy what remained of his relationship with the only family he had left. Dad, you want me to hack into sealed adoption records at 12:40 a.m. on a school night? Noah asked through speakerphone that Elijah had activated so Carolyn could hear her daughter's legal documentation being discussed by a teenager whose computer skills had been developed through years of helping his father pursue unauthorized investigations into cases that official law enforcement had abandoned or forbidden. Noah, I need to verify whether Caroline Weber's adoption paperwork connects to trafficking network that I've been tracking for 8 years, Elijah replied, using language that acknowledged both illegal nature of his request and moral necessity that justified asking his teenage son to commit federal crimes for investigating child trafficking that authorities had refused to pursue when Elijah had been detective with legal authority to investigate such conspiracies. Dad, if I access sealed records without warrant, anything I find is inadmissible and I could face prosecution for unauthorized computer access. Noah replied, with 16-year-old understanding of legal systems that his detective father had taught him through years of explaining why good investigative work sometimes failed to produce justice when procedures mattered more than evidence. But Noah, if you don't access those records, a kidnapped child might remain separated from her biological mother, while Carolyn continues raising daughter who was stolen through trafficking network that may have sold dozens of other children to wealthy families who never questioned where their convenient private adoptions actually came from. Elijah continued, using moral framework that had characterized his parenting since divorce had made him single father whose professional obsessions had nearly destroyed his relationship with his own child. As Noah worked through encrypted databases while Elijah and Caroline waited in tense silence, both adults processed that resolution to Sophia, Emma's identity, would create trauma for multiple parties, regardless of what documentation revealed. If Emma was Sophia, then Caroline would lose daughter she had raised for 8 years, while Maria Martinez would regain daughter who wouldn't remember her. But if Emma was somehow Caroline's biological daughter despite death certificate, then Sophia Martinez remained missing, while Caroline's relief would compound Elijah's failure to find kidnapped child who had been his obsession for nearly a decade. Dad, I found Caroline Weber's adoption records from September 2015. Noah reported at 1:23 a.m., his voice carrying controlled alarm that suggested documentation contained information more complex than simple confirmation of trafficking suspicions. The adoption was processed through Bright Futures Family Services, which was shut down by FBI in 2019 for operating as front for child trafficking network that falsified documents and sold stolen children to wealthy clients who paid premium prices for private adoptions that promised discretion and minimal background investigation. The revelation confirmed Elijah's 8-year suspicions while simultaneously validating Caroline's claims about having legal paperwork. She had paid for legitimate appearing adoption that corrupt agency had processed through fraudulent documentation that made stolen child appear available for legal placement, with family that valued privacy over thorough verification of child's origins. Noah, does the documentation identify Emma's biological parents or provide any information about her background before the adoption? Caroline asked, her voice carrying desperate hope that records might contain evidence contradicting Elijah's identification of Emma as kidnapped Sophia Martinez. The records list Emma's parents as deceased in vehicular accident June 2015, identities sealed to protect minors' privacy. Noah replied, his teenage skepticism about convenient explanations evident in his tone. But Dad, I also found something else in the database that you need to know about. What did you find? Elijah asked, processing that Noah's hesitation suggested discovery beyond simple confirmation of trafficking networks' involvement in Caroline's adoption. I found records showing that Bright Futures Family Services handled another placement in 2012 involving newborn female infant with documentation listing her as abandoned, parents unknown, placed in emergency foster care pending permanent placement. Noah explained, his voice carrying recognition that information he was revealing would complicate rather than resolve the identity crisis consuming his father and Caroline. Noah, why does 2012 abandoned infant matter to Emma's 2015 adoption? Caroline asked, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning to process connections that her desperate denial had been preventing her from acknowledging. Because the 2012 infant was placed through hospital, where Caroline Weber gave birth to daughter that hospital records show died from complications related to premature delivery. Noah replied, his revelation hitting Caroline like detonation as she processed implications that her dead daughter might have been stolen rather than having actually died from medical complications that had never been adequately explained. "My daughter didn't die," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible as she confronted that grief she had been processing for 13 years might have been unnecessary trauma created by criminal conspiracy rather than medical tragedy that she had eventually accepted as unfortunate but natural outcome of complicated pregnancy. Ms. Weber, hospital records from 2012 show that attending physician Dr. Helen Ross documented your daughter's death from respiratory complications, but those same records include signed death certificate and cremation authorization that you supposedly approved, Noah continued, his investigation revealing systematic fraud that extended beyond simple child trafficking to include falsified medical documentation and identity theft. "I never signed cremation authorization," Caroline said, her voice rising as suppressed memories surfaced about hospital experience that had been traumatic blur of grief and medications that had made her unable to process details about daughter's death that hospital staff had handled with efficient professionalism that had seemed compassionate at the time, but which now appeared sinister when examined through lens of trafficking conspiracy. "Ms. Weber, if Dr. Helen Ross falsified your daughter's death and placed her in foster system under fraudulent documentation, then your biological daughter is alive and has been in care system for 11 years while you believed she was dead and eventually adopted another child to replace daughter you thought you'd lost," Elijah said, his voice carrying professional assessment that transformed Caroline's family tragedy from single incident of trafficking victimization into comprehensive conspiracy that had stolen her biological child, while later selling her kidnapped replacement, whose real family had been searching desperately for 8 years. As implications multiplied, Sophia Martinez stolen from Maria and sold to Caroline. Caroline's biological daughter, stolen at birth and hidden in foster system, Dr. Helen Ross operating trafficking network that destroyed multiple families through systematically stealing and selling children. All participants understood that resolution would require choices between competing maternal claims and traumatized children whose identities and family bonds had been constructed through criminal enterprise, that genuine love couldn't legitimate regardless of how completely Caroline had bonded with daughter who had been purchased rather than adopted through ethical processes. Some moral choices require understanding that discovering truth about child trafficking creates obligations to multiple families whose claims can't all be satisfied simultaneously, and that genuine parental love doesn't create ownership when that love was built on criminal conspiracy that stole children from other parents, whose love was equally genuine and whose rights were violated through systems that allowed wealthy people to purchase children without questioning thoroughly enough to prevent trafficking networks from operating through legitimate-appearing adoption agencies. 5 days after Noah's hacking had revealed that Caroline's biological daughter, Emma Weber, was alive in foster care, while the child she had been raising as Emma was actually kidnapped, Sophia Martinez, Elijah found himself sitting across from Maria Martinez in a coffee shop in Little Havana at 9:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning, preparing to deliver news that would either resurrect her hope or compound her trauma by revealing that her daughter had been alive for 8 years, but wouldn't remember the mother who had never stopped searching. "Mr. Carter, when you called saying you had information about Sophia, I didn't sleep for 3 days, Maria said, her hands trembling as she held coffee cup that remained untouched, because maternal desperation made consuming anything impossible when reunion with missing daughter might be hours away. Tell me she's alive. Please tell me my baby is alive." At 42, Maria Martinez possessed the kind of exhausted determination that characterized mothers whose children had been stolen. Her face showed premature aging from 8 years of grief that had consumed her marriage, her career, and her faith in systems that had failed to find daughter who had vanished during momentary inattention that no amount of self-blame could undo or forgive. "Mrs. Martinez, Sophia is alive and healthy, but I need to prepare you for complications that will make reunion more difficult than simply bringing her home," Elijah said, his voice carrying both joy about child's survival and concern about trauma that 8-year separation had created for everyone involved. "I don't care about complications," Maria replied, her voice breaking with emotion that 8 years of suppressed hope was releasing in torrent that made professional caution seem irrelevant compared to maternal need to hold daughter she had been grieving. "Where is she? When can I see her? Does she remember me?" "Ms. Martinez, Sophia has been living as Emma Weber for the past 8 years with a woman named Caroline Weber, who adopted her through trafficking network that sold stolen children to wealthy families," Elijah explained, using direct language for circumstances that required Maria to understand that reunion would compete with existing maternal bond that Sophia had formed with woman who had raised her since age 3. "Someone bought my daughter?" Maria asked, her voice carrying rage that was transforming grief into fury about recognizing that Sophia's disappearance hadn't been random tragedy but deliberate theft for profit that had turned her child into commodity purchased by wealthy stranger. "Who is this woman who paid money for my stolen baby?" "Caroline Weber is a tech CEO who believed she was adopting orphan through legitimate agency," Elijah replied, providing context that complicated rather than resolved moral calculus about competing maternal claims. "She paid $80,000 for what she thought was legal private adoption, and she's been raising Sophia with genuine love for 8 years. Sophia calls her mom and has no memory of you or her life before the adoption." The information hit Maria like betrayal, not just that Sophia had been sold, but that she had bonded with her purchaser so completely that reunion with biological mother would feel like second kidnapping from child's perspective rather than joyful restoration of original family that Maria's grief had been anticipating for 8 years. "So my daughter thinks her kidnapper is her mother," Maria said, her voice carrying devastation about recognizing that Sophia's rescue would traumatize rather than comfort daughter who had adapted to captivity so completely that freedom would feel like loss. "Miss Martinez, Caroline didn't kidnap Sophia. She unknowingly purchased her from trafficking network. But yes, Sophia has formed genuine attachment to Caroline and will experience removal as trauma regardless of how carefully we handle reunion," Elijah confirmed, his professional experience with family separations making him aware that legal and biological rights didn't eliminate psychological reality that Sophia would grieve losing the only mother she consciously remembered. Meanwhile, Caroline Weber was experiencing her own crisis as FBI investigation into Dr. Helen Ross's trafficking network had located her biological daughter Emma in foster care system, where she had been living under name Jane Doe 4721 for 11 years after being placed as abandoned infant, whose origins had been deliberately obscured through falsified documentation designed to prevent anyone from connecting her to wealthy mother who believed her daughter had died. Ms. Weber, we've located your biological daughter in foster care facility in Orlando, FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres reported during their meeting at Caroline's home, where Sophia Emma was playing upstairs, unaware that her entire identity was being discussed by adults whose decisions would determine whether she remained with only mother she knew or was returned to stranger who had biological claim, but no relationship. She's 11 years old, healthy, and has been in system since birth. She's never been adopted because her unknown origins made her legally complicated for families who wanted children with clear backgrounds. My daughter has been in foster care for 11 years while I raised someone else's stolen child? Caroline asked, her voice carrying compound grief about recognizing that her maternal love had been misdirected toward kidnapped child, while her biological daughter had been suffering institutional care that foster system provided to children whose families didn't want them or couldn't be located. Ms. Weber, your biological daughter, legally named Jane, but she's been going by Emma in most recent placement coincidentally, has been waiting for permanent family for her entire life. Agent Torres continued. She's been told her entire life that her parents abandoned her, and discovering that her biological mother is alive and has been searching for her could be either healing revelation or additional trauma, depending on how we handle disclosure. Ooh. As both Maria and Caroline processed that their biological daughters were alive but wouldn't know them, while simultaneously facing reality that children they'd been raising or grieving had been stolen through conspiracy that had destroyed multiple families for profit, all participants understood that resolution would require sacrifices that no legal outcome could make painless for children whose identities had been constructed through criminal enterprise. Agent Torres, what happens to Emma, to Sophia, when you tell her that Caroline isn't her real mother? Elijah asked, his question reflecting professional concern about child's psychological welfare during family reunification that would feel like family destruction from Sophia's perspective. FBI protocol requires that we remove child from adoptive placement when adoption was fraudulent, and we're required to reunite her with biological family after verification, Torres replied, her bureaucratic language concealing human trauma that policy would create. Sophia will be returned to Maria Martinez after brief transition period to prepare her for change in custody. You're going to rip my daughter away from me and give her to stranger? Caroline asked, her voice rising with desperation that maternal love created regardless of legal reality, that her parental rights had been based on purchasing kidnapped child through trafficking network. Emma knows me as her mother. This will destroy her. Ms. Weber, Sophia knows you as her mother because she was stolen from her actual mother when she was 3 years old, Agent Torres replied with professional directness that treated Caroline's grief as less legitimate than Maria's because Caroline's maternal bond had been constructed through criminal purchase rather than biological connection and early childhood relationship that Maria had established before trafficking network had intervened. Over the following days, as legal proceedings began for removing Sophia from Caroline's custody while simultaneously arranging Caroline's reunion with biological daughter who had been stolen at birth, all participants confronted that child trafficking had created impossible situation where every resolution would traumatize someone. Returning Sophia to Maria meant traumatizing child who would lose only mother she remembered. Giving Caroline her biological daughter meant traumatizing 11-year-old who had spent entire life believing she was abandoned, and any delay in either reunion meant extending suffering for biological mothers whose children had been stolen through conspiracy that genuine love from adoptive mother couldn't legitimate. Dad, I don't understand how you're supposed to choose between Caroline's love for Sophia and Maria's right to her daughter, Noah said during their evening conversation about case that had consumed their household since Elijah's recognition had set investigation in motion. They both love their daughters. They're both victims. But Sophia can only have one mother, and whoever doesn't get her will be destroyed. Noah, that's exactly why trafficking is so evil, Elijah replied, using teaching moment to help his son understand moral complexity that his hacking had helped expose. It doesn't just steal children, it creates competing maternal claims that can't all be satisfied. And it traumatizes children whose identities become legal battles rather than stable foundations for development. There is no good outcome here, just choices about which trauma we're going to inflict on which innocent people. Some sacrifices require understanding that exposing trafficking creates obligations that love alone can't resolve, and that protecting children sometimes means choosing between biological rights and psychological bonds when criminal conspiracy has made those competing claims impossible to reconcile without traumatizing someone whose suffering wasn't caused by their own choices, but by systems that allowed children to be stolen and sold to people whose genuine love couldn't legitimate criminal origins of their families. 3 weeks after FBI had begun custody proceedings that would separate Sophia from Caroline while arranging reunification with Maria and simultaneously preparing Caroline's reunion with her biological daughter from foster care, Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at Elijah's modest apartment carrying psychological assessment that would either support immediate family separation or recommend gradual transition designed to minimize trauma for children whose identities were being reconstructed through legal proceedings that treated them as property to be transferred rather than as humans whose emotional bonds required careful management. Mr. Carter, I've completed psychological evaluations of both Sophia and Emma, your biological daughter from foster care, and I need to discuss findings that complicate the FBI's plan for immediate custody transfer, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying professional concern about children whose welfare was being subordinated to legal efficiency that prioritized biological rights over psychological reality. Elijah looked up from case files he'd been reviewing, 8 years of documentation about Sophia Martinez's disappearance that he'd maintained despite being fired, evidence of obsession that had destroyed his marriage but which was now proving crucial for investigation that might redeem his detective work while creating new trauma for children he was trying to protect. What did the evaluations reveal? Elijah asked, recognizing that Dr. Chen's concern suggested that children's psychological states were more complicated than simple victim status that legal proceedings assumed when dealing with trafficking cases. Sophia Martinez, who still identifies as Emma Weber, has no conscious memory of Maria or her life before age 3, Dr. Chen explained, presenting findings that confirmed what everyone had feared about 8-year separation. Her entire identity is constructed around being Caroline's daughter. Immediate removal would represent profound psychological trauma equivalent to kidnapping from her subjective experience, even though legally we're returning her to her rightful family. But Dr. Chen, keeping Sophia with Caroline means extending Maria's suffering and legitimating trafficking by allowing purchaser to retain stolen child because separation would be traumatic, Elijah replied, his voice carrying tension between professional understanding of psychological reality and moral conviction that trafficking victims shouldn't remain with their purchasers, regardless of how genuinely those purchasers loved them. Actually, Mr. Carter, I'm recommending something that neither biological mother will want to hear, but which serves both children's psychological welfare, Dr. Chen continued, presenting proposal that would challenge everyone's assumptions about family reunification. I'm recommending that Sophia and Emma, your Caroline's biological daughter, be placed together in neutral therapeutic foster care, while both sets of mothers participate in graduated reunification therapy that allows children to form relationships with biological families without traumatic removal from existing attachments. The proposal was both psychologically sound and emotionally devastating for mothers whose maternal rights were being subordinated to therapeutic timeline that treated immediate reunion as potentially harmful rather than as obviously beneficial restoration of natural family bonds that trafficking had interrupted. You want to put both children in foster care instead of giving them to their biological mothers? Elijah asked, processing recommendation that seemed to punish victims by delaying reunification that legal rights suggested should be immediate. I want to protect both children from additional trauma by allowing them to form relationships with biological families gradually while maintaining connection to psychological attachments they've already formed, Dr. Chen clarified, providing clinical framework that prioritized children's emotional welfare over adults' parental claims. Sophia needs time to know Maria without losing Caroline entirely, and Emma needs time to know Caroline without feeling abandoned by foster family that's been her only stability, as Dr. Chen's recommendation created alliance between Elijah's protective instincts and her clinical expertise, while simultaneously requiring both Maria and Caroline to accept delayed reunification that subordinated their maternal needs to children's psychological welfare. All participants understood that trafficking had created family structures so complicated that even well-intentioned resolution would require sacrifices that no party wanted to make. Meanwhile, Noah's continued unauthorized hacking had revealed that Dr. Helen Ross's trafficking network had operated for over 15 years and had placed at least 47 stolen children with wealthy families who had paid between $50,000 and $150,000 for private adoptions that promised discretion and minimal background investigation, creating cascade of potential custody battles that could traumatize dozens of children whose identities would be challenged if FBI pursued comprehensive investigation of every placement. Dad, if we expose all 47 cases, we're going to create 47 versions of what's happening with Sophia and Emma, Noah reported during their evening strategy session. 47 kids who will be told their families aren't real. 47 adoptive parents who will lose children they love. 47 biological parents who will get children back who don't remember them. Is that really what we want to do? Noah, those 47 children were stolen from their biological families and sold to people who paid money for human beings, Elijah replied, using moral framework that treated trafficking exposure as obvious good despite recognition that resolution would traumatize everyone involved. We can't leave them with their purchases just because separation would be traumatic. But Dad, what if some of those biological families don't want their children back? Noah asked with 16-year-old directness that cut through adult assumptions about maternal bonds. What if some of those kids were abandoned or removed by CPS before being stolen? What if returning them creates more trauma than letting them stay with families who actually want them? The question revealed complexity that Elijah's detective work had been avoiding. Not all stolen children had been taken from loving families, and not all adoptive families had been knowing participants in trafficking conspiracy, creating moral ambiguity that simple victim-perpetrator framework couldn't adequately address when genuine love existed on both sides of fraudulent adoptions. Over the following weeks, as psychological evaluations continued while legal proceedings advanced toward custody determinations that would affect multiple families, Caroline and Maria formed unlikely alliance based on shared victimization and mutual recognition that their competing maternal claims were both legitimate and impossible to fully satisfy without traumatizing children who had become casualties of trafficking conspiracy. Maria, I know that you hate me for having Sophia while you suffered. Caroline said, during their first face-to-face meeting that Dr. Chen had arranged as part of reunification therapy. "But I need you to know that I didn't know she was stolen, and I love her as completely as you do, even though my love doesn't give me rights that supersede yours." "Caroline, I don't hate you. I hate the people who stole my daughter and sold her to you," Maria replied, her honesty about distinguishing between trafficking network and unwitting purchaser, creating foundation for collaboration rather than conflict. "But I also need you to know that watching Sophia call you Mom while she looks at me like a stranger is destroying me in ways that 8 years of not knowing where she was never did. And I need you to know that meeting Emma, my biological daughter, while knowing I'm going to lose Sophia, is teaching me exactly what you experienced when Sophia was taken," Caroline added, her recognition of parallel suffering creating empathy that competing custody claims might have prevented if both mothers hadn't been forced to experience both sides of trafficking trauma. As their alliance developed through shared therapy sessions and mutual recognition that both children's welfare required cooperation rather than custody battle, both mothers understood that trafficking had created family bonds so complicated that resolution would require choosing children's needs over their own maternal desires when those competing priorities conflicted. Some alliances require understanding that trafficking victims include both biological families and adoptive families when purchases were made through fraud, and that protecting children sometimes means mothers collaborating despite competing claims when children's psychological welfare requires maintaining connections to both families, whose love was genuine even when legal foundations were criminal. The crisis that would determine whether Dr. Helen Ross's trafficking network faced comprehensive exposure or remained partially concealed to protect children who had already adapted to adoptive families reached its breaking point when FBI discovered that Ross had maintained detailed records of all 47 placements, including video documentation of each child's abduction or theft, in encrypted files that Noah's hacking had located, but which federal prosecutors argued couldn't be used as evidence because unauthorized access had violated Fourth Amendment protections against illegal search and seizure. "Mr. Carter, your son's hacking has created legal nightmare where we have evidence of systematic child trafficking, but can't use that evidence in court because it was obtained without warrant," FBI agent Rebecca Torres explained during emergency meeting at Federal Building where Elijah, Noah, Carolyn and Maria had been summoned to discuss prosecution strategy. Defense attorneys will argue that everything Noah found is inadmissible fruit of poisonous tree, and without that evidence we can't prove systematic conspiracy, only individual cases where we can demonstrate trafficking through legally obtained documentation. Deal. The legal technicality meant that exposing Ross's complete network would require either finding alternative evidence that replicated Noah's discoveries through proper investigative procedures or accepting that most trafficking victims would never be identified, because protecting Noah from prosecution for unauthorized computer access mattered more to legal system than protecting 47 children whose identities had been stolen through conspiracy that federal evidence rules would help. Concealed. Agent Torres, are you saying that we're going to let 46 children remain with families who purchased them through trafficking network because my son used illegal hacking to find evidence that FBI couldn't locate through proper procedures? Elijah asked, his voice carrying controlled fury about recognizing that legal system prioritized procedural correctness over child protection when those competing values conflicted. Mr. Carter, I'm saying that we can only prosecute cases where we can obtain evidence through constitutional procedures. And that means we can only pursue Sophia's case because you recognized her through your own observation rather than through Noah's hacking, Torres replied, using bureaucratic language that treated 46 children's continued separation from biological families as acceptable cost of maintaining Fourth Amendment protections. But Agent Torres, Noah's files show exactly where each child was taken from and who purchased them. Caroline interjected, her voice carrying desperation about recognizing that systematic exposure could help other families avoid the trauma she was experiencing. We can't just ignore that information because of how it was obtained. Ms. Weber, using illegally obtained evidence, would establish precedent that encourages vigilante hacking of private records whenever someone suspects wrongdoing, Torres explained, providing legal framework that treated procedural protections as more important than substantive justice when those values competed. Federal courts have been clear that Fourth Amendment violations taint all subsequently discovered evidence, regardless of how compelling that evidence might be. Meanwhile, Dr. Helen Ross's defense attorney had filed motion to suppress all evidence related to Sophia's case by arguing that Elijah's identification had been influenced by Noah's prior hacking of adoption records, creating chain of illegal discovery that contaminated even Elijah's legitimate visual recognition of missing child, whose case he had been obsessively researching for 8 years. Your Honor, Mr. Carter's identification of Sophia Martinez was not independent observation, but rather confirmation of information his son had obtained through illegal hacking of sealed adoption records, argued defense attorney Philip Hawthorne during suppression hearing that would determine whether Sophia's reunification with Maria could proceed or would be blocked by legal technicalities. The temporal proximity between Noah Carter's hacking and Elijah Carter's recognition of the child suggests that his identification was tainted by illegally obtained knowledge rather than representing legitimate detective work. The legal argument was both technically sophisticated and morally reprehensible, using procedural protections designed to prevent government overreach to shield trafficking network from exposure, while positioning Elijah's detective expertise as contaminated by his son's unauthorized investigation. Your Honor, I recognize Sophia Martinez through her distinctive heterochromia, birthmark, and crooked pinky finger, features that were documented in missing persons bulletins I had been studying for 8 years before my son conducted any computer research, Elijah testified, his voice carrying controlled emotion about having his professional expertise challenged by defense attorney who was arguing that trafficking victims should remain with her purchaser because the detective who found her had a son who knew how to hack computers. But Mr. Carter, you admit that your son accessed Caroline Weber's adoption records before you made your identification, Judge Morrison pressed, her questioning revealing that legal outcome would depend on whether Elijah's recognition had been truly independent or had been influenced by Noah's prior discovery of trafficking networks documentation. Your Honor, I recognized Sophia's face in the photograph on Caroline's desk through my own observation before Noah accessed any records, Elijah replied. Though the timeline was close enough that defense attorneys could argue that Noah's dinner-table conversations about his hacking had subconsciously influenced Elijah's subsequent identification, as legal proceedings threatened to collapse the entire case through procedural technicalities, while Dr. Ross's trafficking network remained largely unexposed because evidence had been obtained through unauthorized hacking. Maria Martinez made decision that would either save the prosecution or destroy her own chance at reunification with daughter she had been seeking for 8 years. Your Honor, I want to withdraw my custody claim for Sophia, Maria announced during hearing, her statement shocking everyone present, including her own attorney, who had been preparing arguments for immediate reunification based on biological rights. I've spent 8 years wanting my daughter back, but I've spent the past 3 weeks watching her psychological evaluations, and I understand that forcing her to leave Caroline would traumatize her in ways that I can't justify just to satisfy my own maternal needs. The withdrawal was both legally strategic and emotionally devastating. Maria was sacrificing her parental rights to prevent defense attorneys from using procedural technicalities to block prosecution, while simultaneously acknowledging that Sophia's psychological welfare required maintaining connection to Caroline, that immediate custody transfer would sever. Ms. Martinez, are you certain you want to withdraw your custody claim? Judge Morrison asked, her voice carrying judicial concern about mother making irreversible decision under emotional duress. Your Honor, I'm not withdrawing permanently. I'm requesting that custody remain with Caroline temporarily while Sophia participates in reunification therapy that allows her to form relationship with me gradually, Maria clarified, her modification transforming withdrawal into strategic compromise that prioritized Sophia's psychological needs over her own parental rights. I'm willing to wait years if necessary for Sophia to be ready to know me, because forcing her to accept me immediately would make me the kidnapper in her experience, even though legally I'm her mother. Modua. The statement represented profound maternal sacrifice. Maria was choosing Sophia's emotional welfare over her own legal rights, accepting that genuine motherhood sometimes required relinquishing custody when insisting on immediate rights would traumatize child whose identity had been constructed through years of separation. And Ms. Weber, how do you respond to Ms. Martinez's proposal? Judge Morrison asked, recognizing that resolution would require Caroline's cooperation in reunification process that would eventually transfer some custody to Maria, even if immediate removal was delayed. Your Honor, I'm willing to participate in graduated reunification therapy where Sophia can form relationship with Maria while maintaining connection to me, Caroline replied, her acceptance representing recognition that her maternal bond with Sophia didn't eliminate Maria's rights, but rather created shared responsibility for child's welfare. I love Sophia enough to share her with her biological mother if that's what her psychological health requires, even though sharing her means accepting that I'll eventually lose primary custody to woman who has greater claim than my purchase gave me. As both mothers agreed to prioritize Sophia's needs over their competing claims, while simultaneously accepting that Dr. Ross's trafficking network would remain largely unexposed because legal system valued procedural protections over comprehensive victim identification, all participants understood that justice was being sacrificed for child welfare while systematic crime was being partially concealed to protect prosecutorial viability in single case that legal technicalities hadn't yet destroyed. Some confrontations with institutional evil require choosing between exposing complete conspiracy and protecting individual victims, when legal systems prioritize procedural correctness over substantive justice, and accepting that genuine maternal love sometimes requires sacrificing parental rights when insisting on immediate custody would traumatize children whose identities were constructed through years of separation that no legal ruling could instantly undo. 26 months after Maria Martinez had agreed to graduated reunification that prioritized Sophia's psychological welfare over her own parental rights, while Caroline Weber had accepted shared custody arrangement that acknowledged both women's maternal bonds, Elijah Carter stood in family courtroom watching final custody hearing that would determine whether experimental co-parenting arrangement between biological mother and adoptive mother could become legally recognized family structure that served child's interests better than traditional custody battle would have accomplished. The courtroom was unusually full, not just with parties directly involved in Sophia's case, but with representatives from 17 other families whose children had been identified through Dr. Ross's trafficking network after FBI had obtained warrants replicating Noah's unauthorized discoveries through constitutional procedures that had taken 18 months to execute properly, but which had ultimately exposed additional victims without relying on illegally obtained evidence. Your Honor, Over the past 2 years, Sophia Martinez Weber has participated in intensive reunification therapy while maintaining residence with Caroline Weber and spending graduated increasing time with Maria Martinez, testified Dr. Patricia Chen, whose psychological monitoring had documented Sophia's adjustment to knowing both mothers. She now identifies both women as her mothers, Caroline as mom, who raised her, and Maria as mama, who gave birth to her. And she has formed secure attachments to both families rather than experiencing reunification as loss of one mother to gain another. At 50 years old, Elijah possessed integrated professional identity that characterized former detectives whose greatest failure had been transformed into systematic reform. His recognition of Sophia had been vindicated despite legal challenges. His obsessive case documentation had proved crucial for additional victim identification, and his collaboration with Sun, whose hacking had initiated investigation, had created partnership that balanced Noah's technical skills with Elijah's investigative expertise in ways that benefited both their relationship and their community impact. Mr. Carter, the court recognizes that your identification of Sophia Martinez initiated investigation that has now resulted in reunification of 17 families whose children were stolen through Dr. Ross's trafficking network, Judge Morrison acknowledged during proceedings. Your persistence in maintaining case files, despite being terminated 8 years ago, represents exactly the kind of professional dedication that protects vulnerable populations when institutional systems fail to pursue investigations that seem too complicated or resource-intensive for normal law enforcement priorities. The judicial recognition was both professionally validating and personally bittersweet. Elijah had been right about trafficking conspiracy, but his vindication had come 8 years too late to prevent Sophia's childhood from being stolen, and had required destroying his career before truth could be acknowledged by authorities who had dismissed his concerns as conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, Caroline Weber was experiencing her own transformation as her reunion with biological daughter Emma had required forming maternal bond with 11-year-old who had spent entire life in foster care believing she was abandoned, creating second complicated family structure where Caroline was learning to mother child who resembled her genetically but who had no shared history or natural connection that years of separation had eliminated. Emma told her therapist that she's struggling with feeling guilty about being happy to have a mother, because it means accepting that Sophia was kidnapped so Emma could be found, reported Emma's social worker during their regular consultation about adjustment challenges. She's processing that her reunion with you came at cost of Sophia's separation from you, creating survivor guilt about family structure that benefits her while traumatizing sister she's never met but whose loss made Emma's discovery possible. At 41, Caroline possessed hard-earned wisdom about motherhood's complexity, having learned through raising Sophia and reuniting with Emma that genuine maternal love required accepting children's emotional reality rather than imposing idealized family structures that served adult needs more than children's developmental requirements. Sophia needed both mothers despite legal complications. Emma needed time to trust that Caroline's love wouldn't disappear despite years of institutional care. That had taught her not to expect permanence, and Caroline needed to accept that perfect motherhood was impossible when trafficking conspiracy had created family bonds so complicated that love alone couldn't resolve structural challenges. As final custody hearing concluded with judge approving shared custody arrangement that gave Maria primary legal custody while Caroline retained significant parenting time and decision-making authority, all participants understood that trafficking had created family structure that traditional legal categories couldn't adequately address. Sophia had 2 mothers whose claims were both legitimate. Emma had mother she'd never known who was learning to parent traumatized child, and Noah had father whose obsessive pursuit of justice had nearly destroyed their relationship but had ultimately created purpose that benefited both their family and their community. Sophia, do you understand what today's ruling means for your family? Dr. Chen asked during post-hearing therapy session that helped 11-year-old process legal outcome. It means I get to keep both my mums instead of having to choose, Sophia replied with 11-year-old clarity that cut through adult legal complexity. Mama Maria is my first mom, who I don't remember, but who never stopped looking for me. And Mom Caroline is my second mom, who didn't know I was stolen, but who loved me anyway. The judge said I can love both of them, and that makes me luckier than kids who only have one mom. The child's perspective revealed that trafficking's trauma could be mitigated when adults prioritize child's needs over their own competing claims, and that family structures created through criminal conspiracy could be transformed into sources of strength when love proved more powerful than legal categories in determining what served children's welfare. 3 years after Elijah had recognized Sophia's face and initiated investigation that would expose Dr. Ross's 15-year trafficking operation, he stood at community center that had been established to support families affected by child trafficking, both biological families seeking stolen children and adoptive families discovering their purchases had been fraudulent. Watching Maria and Caroline co-host support group for mothers navigating shared custody arrangements that resulted from trafficking reunifications. What we've learned, Maria told assembled families whose circumstances mirrored Sophia's case in various ways, is that trafficking creates family bonds so complicated that legal systems can't resolve them through traditional custody battles that assume children can only have one legitimate family. Caroline and I both love Sophia completely, and Sophia needs both of us, despite legal reality that only one of us should be her mother, according to traditional family structures. And what we've discovered, Caroline added, her collaboration with Maria representing friendship that trafficking conspiracy might have prevented if both mothers hadn't chosen cooperation over conflict, is that sharing custody of child you love is better than fighting custody battle that traumatizes child while satisfying adult need for exclusive parental control. Sophia is healthier having both of us than she would be if court had forced her to choose, or if Maria and I had fought over her like she was property to be won, rather than human whose welfare required both her mother's cooperation. Some families are created not through biology or legal adoption, but through complicated circumstances that require redefining family beyond traditional categories, and the most meaningful resolution of trafficking trauma often emerges not from custody battles that prioritize adult rights, but from collaborative parenting that serves children's psychological needs, even when that collaboration requires mothers sharing children. They both love with competing claimants whose rights are equally legitimate despite seemingly incompatible legal claims. If this story devastated you, if you're thinking about Sophia having two mothers who both love her, if you're haunted by the 47 children who were stolen and sold, if you're processing what it means that Emma spent 11 years in foster care while her biological mother thought she was dead, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel. Because we don't just tell stories, we expose the darkest corners of human trafficking, the foster care system's failures, and the impossible choices that come when criminal conspiracy creates family bonds that love can't resolve alone. Hit that like button if this story moved you. If you felt Maria's 8 years of grief. If you understood Caroline's horror at discovering her daughter was stolen. If you recognize that Elijah's obsession cost him his marriage, but saved 17 families. But most importantly, comment below and tell me, what did you think of this story? Have you ever discovered that something fundamental about your family wasn't true? Do you know anyone who was adopted and later learned their adoption was fraudulent? Have you ever had to choose between what was legally right and what was emotionally necessary? And here's the hardest question. If you were Sophia, would you want to be with the mother who gave birth to you but you don't remember? Or the mother who raised you but purchased you through trafficking? Is there a right answer to that question? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that child trafficking isn't just about strangers in vans. It's about corrupt doctors falsifying death certificates, adoption agencies that don't ask enough questions, and wealthy families who pay premium prices for children without wondering why those children are so conveniently available. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, there are currently over 400,000 children in the U.S. foster care system, and an unknown number of private adoptions that may have involved trafficking networks similar to Dr. Ross's operation. Sophia's story is fiction, but the system that allowed it to happen is terrifyingly real. If you suspect child trafficking, contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-788. If you're an adoptive parent with questions about your adoption's legitimacy, seek legal counsel. If you're searching for a missing child, don't give up. Elijah didn't, and 17 families were reunited because he kept searching when everyone told him to stop. Subscribe, like, comment, share. And if you're a parent right now, whether biological, adoptive, or foster, hold your children close and remember that every child deserves to know who they really are, even when that truth is complicated. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story, but remember, somewhere tonight there's another Sophia, another Maria searching, another Caroline who doesn't know the truth, another Elijah who sees something nobody else notices. Don't look away.